January 15th, 2007. It was a cold night in Seoul at a quiet apartment complex in Jamsil neighborhood. A man hidden inside of a large brown coat crouches down beside the building's stairwell to rummage through a black bag. Inside, he's packed a kitchen knife, a handful of arrows, and a crossbow. He waits until he sees a middle-aged man turn the corner, coming towards the elevators. Judge Park Hong-woo presses the elevator button. He's coming home after a very long day, a day spent issuing rulings, including one that effectively ended a man's 10-year legal battle to be reinstated as a university professor. The crouched man yells out his name, and the judge turns. Now the man is holding the crossbow up, aimed at Judge Park. He says, "This is your verdict." Before the judge can even open his mouth to ask, "Who are you?" or "What do you want?" an arrow is sent flying. The judge falls backwards onto the ground and soon begins a case that will leave the question, is he a vigilante or a villain? Was this a deranged act of revenge, or the last protest of a man who spent a decade pleading for justice, only to find the court stacked against him? Welcome to Korean True Crime with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to my amazing patrons for making this show possible. You truly mean the world to me. If you want to join Korean True Crime on Patreon, you can find the link in the description. You can also join us on Discord for fun discussions and movie nights. If you'd like to chat with me and other listeners, join us on Discord. If you're interested in new merch for the show, you can find our new design Gatsrat on my Fourth Wall store, which you can also find the link to in the description or on any of my socials. Surprisingly, there is no content warning for today's episode, so let's get into it. The crossbow-wielding man at the center of this case, Kim Myeong-ho, wasn't a criminal, at least not at first. He never intended to be. He was, by all accounts, a normal, boring, but highly respected academic. He was born in 1952. At the time of the crime, he was 55 years old. Kim Myeong-ho earned his undergraduate degree at Seoul National University, one of Korea's most prestigious universities. Then, he went on to earn his PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan in the United States of America in 1988. He specialized in applied math and mathematical physics. He was a man who appreciated precision and organization. Things were the way they should be. In 1991, he returned to Korea and was hired at Sungkyunkwan University, which is one of the country's oldest and most respected schools. It was established in 1398. As a science and engineering school. It's interesting to learn that Sungkyunkwan University was established during the Joseon Dynasty, but unfortunately, many of the original buildings don't exist because during Japanese invasions in the late 1590s, they burned most of them down. Sungkyunkwan is considered the top third university in South Korea, right behind Seoul National University and Yonsei. When Kim Myeong-ho started working there, he was 39 years old, which is a little bit older than the other assistant professors, but he had taken his time with his education, spent a lot of time in his youth traveling. But he rigorously started researching for the university and quickly put out dozens of academic work in international journals. He was fluent in English, mathematically fluent in several programming languages, which put him at an advantage to publish to both Korean and Western journals. But although he professionally was very efficient and productive, his personality was where he struggled. Kim Myeong-ho was known to be exacting. Some would say he was confrontational at times. Others flat out said he lacked any social skills whatsoever. His bluntness could be very disarming, especially considering his historic university really valued hierarchical seniority, whereas he preferred treating everyone equally and used honesty above all else. Blunt honesty is not everyone's cup of tea, and it seemed to not be very popular for Kim Myeong-ho's coworkers. But regardless, he worked at Sungkyunkwan University for 4 years without any incidents. Then, in January 1995, that's when his entire career derailed. That winter, Kim Myeong-ho asked to help grade the university's mathematics entrance exam, which is a very important test for Korea's fiercely competitive college admissions process. The mathematics entrance exam is part of South Korea's College Scholastic Ability Test, or the CSAT, sometimes also called the Suneung. This can be compared to national tests from other countries, but the CSAT is insanely competitive, notoriously difficult. The mathematics portion of the CSAT is divided into 2 types. The first type is for humanities or social sciences. The second one is for natural sciences and engineering. Students will then have to take Math 1, which is logarithms, sequences, and trigonometry. Then Math 2, which is limits, precalculus, and calculus. After that, they can choose elective topics from probability and statistics, geometry, or advanced calculus. The exam itself is 30 questions, 21 multiple choice, and 9 short answers. No calculators allowed. The questions are weighted differently depending on the difficulty of the question, but there are some questions known on the test as killer questions. These are worth the most points, obviously, and they require the high school test takers to already be at a collegiate level to answer them. Less than 5% of test takers pass the killer questions. In more recent years, they've stopped including them altogether. To gain admissions to any of the mid-tier schools, not the top, just a normal university, you would need to get a 90% or higher. The top universities, like Sungkyunkwan, you need a 97% or higher. We've discussed this test very briefly before in the episode Genius Turned Killer because of how rare it is for a student to get a perfect score. It's less than 5 people every year, and 500,000 students take it every year. Kim Myeong-ho wanted to help grade this entrance exam. It would be an honor and a huge responsibility, but he also felt confident that he was an expert in his field. So the university agreed and started sending him the tests to review. That's when a problem arose. The math portion of the test was worth 100 points. One of the more heavily weighted questions was worth 15 of those points. And it stood out to Kim Myeong-ho immediately. Out of curiosity, he had been going through the test, answering the questions himself. At first, this question gave him some difficulty. But it wasn't like he was rusty. He was teaching math 10 times harder than this daily. No, the question didn't make sense. The question was flawed. It was mathematically wrong. He reviewed the test teacher packet, which had the model answer. It explained different ways to get the answer and how students might come to that conclusion. But he discovered that the model answer did not fit into this equation. This killer question was impossible to get right for any student. That's a huge deal because this test determines the future for many students who study day in and day out. This question may have meant some students did not get admitted to the university that should have. So he rushed the issue to the exam committee, and they agreed with him. The problem contained an error that made the answer impossible. Kim Myeong-ho was so dedicated to the truth and passionate about correcting this problem that would affect hundreds of thousands of test takers that he took the issue to the university president, making sure to document thoroughly his findings, and he wanted to press for them to make the correction. He knew that this would lead to many angry students who likely would have to retake the math portion of the test, if not the entire test. That's when the issues began. In an academic environment where public dissent is treated as betrayal because you're sticking out too much, you're whistleblowing, you're causing problems, Kim Myeong-ho's actions of going to the exam committee were not seen as a dedicated educator wanting the best for the nation's students. It was seen as insubordinate. He was airing their dirty laundry, which could harm the university's reputation. The university's other mathematics professors submitted a formal request for disciplinary action against Kim Myeong-ho. And in December 1995, a year after he started making noise about the error, he was placed on a 3-month suspension. And that didn't sit well with him, because he did nothing wrong. In early 1996, a few months later, when his employment contract was up for review, the university, of course, rejected him for reappointment, despite the fact he was still one of the top academics in his field. For all purposes, any university would have wanted him. Officially, the reason for his non-renewal was for unprofessional conduct. And inadequate research performance. But the truth was simpler and darker. He had embarrassed the university by pointing out a mistake they made, and in return, they were silencing him. For Kim Myeong-ho, this wasn't just a professional setback. This was the beginning of a long fight to earn back his credibility and reputation. This fight would cost him his career, his reputation, and eventually his freedom. In October 1995, before the suspension started, Kim Myeong-ho filed a civil lawsuit to have his assistant professorship reinstated. He argued that his dismissal had been retaliatory and that the university had acted in bad faith. Unfortunately for him, the courts disagreed in a ruling that would later become a magnet for controversy. The Seoul District Court sided with Sungkyunkwan University. The judge wrote that the appointment of associate professors was entirely at the discretion of the university. This ruling was backed by a Supreme Court precedent from 1987, one that overrode a more protective ruling 10 years prior in 1977. That one had stated that reappointment should be expected unless there are special circumstances. According to Kim Myeong-ho, the 1987 precedent had been adopted illegally, without the required unanimous decision of the Supreme Court justices. It contradicted the Court Organization Act, and it handed private university foundations the unchecked power to dismiss professors for virtually any reason, like embarrassing them. Over the next decade, Kim Myeong-ho's life would be dedicated to this. In 1996, he decided to leave South Korea. He spent years in the United States and New Zealand working as an unpaid research professor. But the fight never left him. He always wanted to fight for what was right. In 2005, a reform to Korea's Private School Act offered a new legal opening. Professors who had been denied reappointment could now file a new lawsuit or hearing. So Kim Myeong-ho returned to Korea immediately. This would be a chance to get his life back again as a respected professor. So he refiled his lawsuit to confirm his status as a professor. He submitted evidence of his academic record, which included several papers published in world-renowned journals, including the Journal of Mathematical Physics. He was supported by 189 math professors from 44 different Korean universities, who all agreed to sign a statement asserting that he had raised a legitimate academic concern in 1985 and that his dismissal was unwarranted and downright offensive. Because of the university's actions, students had a highly competent professor taken away from them because the university made a mistake, and he was honest enough to want the best for the students. Even international figures like Professor Michael Attia and Yale's Professor Seo Ji-rang voiced their support for him. Science magazine ran an article titled "The High Cost of a Right Answer." The Mathematical Intelligencer published another article titled "The Rewards of Honesty." It seemed like the entire world had his back. Everyone could agree that he was let go in bad faith, but none of that mattered. In September 2005, the lower court ruled against him once again. In January 2007, the Seoul High Court's Second Division affirmed that ruling. The presiding judge of that appeal panel was Judge Park Hong-woo. And just 3 days after that ruling, Kim Myeong-ho would be standing in front of him, waving a crossbow. So we return to the evening of January 15th, 2007, when Kim Myeong-ho stepped into the lobby of the apartment complex in Jamsil-dong, Seoul. It was a quiet evening around 7 p.m., when most of the building's residents were either eating dinner or still commuting home. This was the home of Judge Park Hong-woo of the Seoul High Court's Second Civil Division. This was the judge who had denied his appeal in the lawsuit that consumed almost a decade of his life. It was all over because of this judge's decision. Kim Myeong-ho waited on the staircase. He had with him a crossbow roughly 80 centimeters long, along with a bag containing 9 arrows tied with a string, and by some accounts, a 35-centimeter knife. He says he brought the crossbow to confront the judge, not to kill him. He just wanted to intimidate him. The prosecution said otherwise. At 7:08 p.m., Judge Park entered the apartment lobby and pressed the elevator button. As he waited for that elevator to come down, Kim Myeong-ho stepped out and confronted him. What happened next would become the topic of years of legal battles, forensic reports, reenactments, and public speculation. And what people believe happened next determines who is the villain in our story. It's hard to reserve judgment when you're presenting this case, but if you want to discuss it, join me on Discord. According to Judge Park, he turned to see Kim holding something low near his waist, something shaped like a crossbow. There was a confrontation. In that scuffle, a crossbow bolt struck Judge Park in the lower left abdomen, or so Park claimed later. Here's the thing though, nobody saw an arrow fired, not even Judge Park. He testified that he didn't remember exactly when or how he was hit. At some point, he said, he realized that he had been shot and pulled the arrow out of his body. Kim Myeong-ho claimed the weapon had discharged accidentally during the altercation. Whatever the cause, Park Hong-woo and Kim Myeong-ho fell to the ground together. Judge Park said he was underneath Kim Myeong-ho and feared for his life. He screamed for help. Within seconds, 2 men came running. Judge Park's personal driver and a security guard from the building. They pulled Kim Myeong-ho off of the judge. The security guard and the driver held him until the police arrived. Kim Myeong-ho didn't fight them or resist. According to court testimony, Kim Myeong-ho stood calmly in the lobby. His belongings, including the crossbow, arrows, and the knife, were laid out neatly on the ground nearby. Judge Park was taken to the hospital. He was transported to Seoul Medical Center with what initially was reported as a non-life-threatening puncture wound. His organs were undamaged, and soon he was released after some bandaging. But discrepancies began to start. First, there was the blood. Judge Park reportedly was bleeding when paramedics arrived, but the forensic analysis showed no blood stains on the abdomen of his shirt he was wearing, allegedly where he was hit in the lower left abdomen. Instead, blood was only found on the wrist of his shirt. The National Forensic Service could not confirm whether the blood belonged to Judge Park or not, and we'll get into that later. There were also inconsistencies with the arrow itself. Judge Park claimed he had pulled a broken arrow out of his side, and yet the police could never find the arrow. And the 3 arrows sent to the National Forensic Service were all from his bag. They were unused. There was no blood on them, and they were undamaged. This so-called broken arrow, which the judge had allegedly handed to the security officer, disappeared. There was no record, no tests done, no nothing. Still, the damage was done. Kim Myeong-ho had attacked a judge. He was arrested on the spot and charged with attempted murder and violations of the Firearms and Explosives Control Act. The story was already taking shape in the media. Disgruntled former professor retaliated against a judge. That night, news anchors across Korea used the same phrase to describe what happened. Seoul High Court 2nd Division Chief Judge Park Hong-woo was attacked by a former university professor with a crossbow. They would go on to call it the crossbow terrorist incident. Then, as more was discovered about the case, the headlines read, Professor Kim Myeong-ho dismissed from university for misconduct, ambushed a sitting judge with a deadly weapon. Then even later, they all read, shocking case of judicial terrorism. What does this mean for Korea's legal system? They weren't using the word terrorism lightly. Just hours after the incident, South Korea's Supreme Court called an emergency meeting. The Chief Justice himself declared the event a grave threat to the rule of law. Across the country, court officials were briefed on the situation and told to prepare official statements. News outlets weren't framing the case as just a crime of retaliation, but as a symbolic act of violence against the nation's entire judicial system. The message was clear. Kim Myeong-ho did not retaliate against man. He had attacked a system itself. And not to sound dramatic, but the system was about to hit him back. Kim Myeong-ho was remanded to pretrial detention and transferred to Seoul Detention Center with no bail. He would remain in custody for more than 10 months before his first trial would even begin. In the meantime, Park Hong-woo, whose name was now permanently associated with this case, was promoted. He became chief judge of Uijeongbu District Court. To Korea, Kim Myeong-ho, once a highly respected academic, was a lunatic, a domestic terrorist. And when it came to the trial, the story was far more complicated than any of this. Kim Myeong-ho stepped into courtroom 1 at Seoul Eastern District Court on August 28, 2007. The judge presiding was Judge Kim Yong-ho. His prosecutor was Baek Jae-myung. He sat across from the witness, Judge Park Hong-woo. The prosecution and defense have already met with the judge and gone over the case. Kim Myeong-ho had already been coached on what to say, but he wasn't going to follow the script. He walked in shackled, dressed in a brown prison uniform, carrying a stack of legal documents. And immediately, he challenged the court's authority. He looked up at Judge Kim Myeong-ho and said, "I do not recognize you as a judge, so I will refer to you as Mr. Kim Myeong-ho." It's needless to say that judges are quite defensive about honorifics, so this was an ultimate disrespect. For many Koreans, this criminal trial was not about an assault. It was now about the legitimacy of the judiciary altogether. And the courtroom was packed. More than 70 people filled the gallery. A lot of them were activists who viewed Kim Myeong-ho as this Guy Fawkes-type revolutionary against the unjust judiciary. When Judge Park entered to testify, he was wearing this gray suit and slicked back hair. He was also escorted by security. He swore the oath and took the stand. Everyone was waiting for what he was going to say. What exactly happened in that apartment lobby? To paraphrase, he said, "I pressed the elevator button. I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw Kim Myeong-ho holding something like a crossbow. He approached me. I don't remember the exact moment, but I realized I'd been hit, so I pulled the arrow out myself." And I'm not paraphrasing a lot. The story was incredibly vague. That is what was so remarkable about it. He didn't offer really any critical information. He was a judge. He should know how important it is to include every single minor detail in your testimony. And under cross-examination, he finally conceded some more critical information. He revealed that he never saw the crossbow being fired. He didn't feel the moment of impact, and he later changed clothes before going to the hospital. That's why there were no blood on them. And the shirt he wore, which was an essential piece of evidence, he only turned over later after his mother had washed it. Yet he still maintained that he had been shot and pulled the arrow out of his abdomen. But the forensic evidence painted a more muddy picture about what happened. The shirt he wore, which was sent to the National Forensic Service later, contained no bloodstains on the abdomen where the injury supposedly happened. Even if he had changed his clothes before going to the hospital, there still would be some traces of blood in the area on both the washed shirt and the new shirt. If you had an arrow sticking out of your stomach that you freshly removed, you would be bleeding heavily, even if it was just a skin wound, even if it missed major organs. The forensic service, however, did find blood on the sleeve around his right wrist, but not on the torso. The forensic lab report found no traces of Kim Myeong-ho's DNA on the shirt, but they failed to test the discovered blood to see if it even belonged to Judge Park Hong-woo. What's even crazier is that the alleged arrow that was pulled from the body still had not been found during the trial. It had actually vanished. Think about this. This is a case built on a physical injury, but the weapon is missing, the forensic trail is inconclusive, and the injury itself can't even be medically verified. If you believe Kim Myeong-ho, this should exonerate him completely. According to Judge Park's own courtroom testimony, he was hit by the crossbow bolt. He pulled it out of his stomach, handed it to the apartment security guard. The guard, in turn, said he gave it to the police. Those police officers never entered anything into evidence. Instead, 3 of the unused arrows were sent to the National Forensic Service. The National Forensic Service confirmed that the arrows had not been used. They had no traces of human blood. No biological traces at all. The second piece of damning evidence was the blood. Judge Park claimed that he was shot in the lower left abdomen. He said he bled a lot, and in court he submitted his clothing from that day, although that was the one his mother had washed. There were 3 pieces to it: a white button-up shirt, a vest, and then a suit jacket. According to his testimony, the arrow hit him where his jacket, vest, shirt, pants, and underwear overlapped at his waistband. Yet the only thing that had blood on it was his underwear and the wrist of his shirt. This indicates that there was no puncture wound, that the arrow did not pierce through his clothes. Instead, it just struck him hard enough to kind of scratch or cut the skin underneath. The defense spoke about this during the trial because it was a huge point of contention. Did he pull an arrow out of his abdomen? Had the arrow punctured his skin, or had it just hit him hard enough to give him the equivalent of a scraped knee? They demanded an explanation, but the judge dismissed the request. They didn't order any tests to determine the legitimacy of the injuries. The court also had to determine the intent of the attack. Kim Myeong-ho never denied bringing the crossbow. He admitted he went there to confront the judge, and he claimed that the arrow discharged accidentally when he started to get into an argument. He tried to get a punch in, and the two fell to the ground. The crossbow was never raised pointing at him. The crossbow was aiming at the ground at waist level. However, Judge Park said that he was waving it around like a lunatic and aiming it straight at him. And then he deliberately fired from about 1.5 meters away while shouting, "This is your verdict." But no witnesses actually saw the moment or heard this. Judge Park, in fact, even testified that he didn't even see the arrow be fired. He only realized he had been hit after the fact. There was no sound of the weapon firing, and no one claimed to have seen him pull the string back to load the weapon. In court, the defense team produced an expert report showing that when the same model crossbow was fired under the exact same conditions, it pierced 15 centimeters into a pork slab. If it was half fired or the bolt was unlatched, it would only penetrate about 2.5 centimeters. The latter would match the depth of what Judge Park's wound probably was. This mattered because Judge Park's wound was so superficial that he didn't even notice when he was injured. He climbed up the stairs to go to his apartment, changed his clothes, and then only later noticed that he had been scratched and went to the hospital. Yeah, the images they took of him in the hospital made it look like he had entered into major surgery. If Kim Myeong-ho had intended to kill the judge, he probably would have. If he had fired from 1.5 meters away with a fully latched bolt, pulled the trigger, it would have pierced him 15 centimeters deep. The weapon he brought was capable of far greater damage, but that's not what happened. He hadn't even cocked the crossbow to be ready to fire. The prosecution also discussed the 35-centimeter knife that was discovered at the scene in his black bag, and they used it to argue that the attack was premeditated. He brought a knife to kill him. Kim Myeong-ho stated that he kept that knife in his bag and didn't even know it was there. It was a hunting knife that he kept in his crossbow bag. He never intended to use it on the judge, it just was in his bag. There's one last detail, and that is that when Judge Park said that the police arrived, all of the arrows and the rope and everything had been laid out in preparation near the stairwell. Well, there are no photographs of this from the police, and the police hadn't mentioned seeing any of this. Kim Myeong-ho denied that ever happened. Yes, he had a few extra bolts in his bag with the knife, but the bag was zipped closed the entire time. Kim Myeong-ho, at this point, wasn't even challenging the evidence, he was challenging the entire premise of the trial. Let me remind you that Kim Myeong-ho is a very blunt, outspoken person who speaks up immediately when anything is wrong. So he's interrupting the testimonies. He's demanding cross-examination rights. He was even shouting out that they weren't following constitutional law. And he demanded that they reenact the incident right then and there with the same crossbow in the courtroom. When they refused, he screamed out, "This isn't a trial. This is bullshit." The judge threatened to remove him from the proceedings, but everyone in the gallery was clapping for him, and a few were even laughing. A woman who was sitting in the back of the gallery even took out an egg and threw it at the judges. Kim Myeong-ho was right, though. There wasn't really any evidence. There's only a testimony that contradicted itself. He was never denying intimidating the judge. He was denying intentionally harming him. He asked the court, please, test the shirt again, find the arrow, hire some expert witnesses, or cross-examine the arresting officer. Yet they refused all of it. The attorneys had to file 18 separate motions to preserve evidence and introduce forensic review, all of which ended up being denied anyways. The overseeing judge, Kim Myeong-ho, said, "This isn't a political show for you." And to spectators and Kim Myeong-ho, it seemed like the judges had already decided on his guilt before he even came into the trial. And it was obvious why, because the victim was one of their own. They were protecting a fellow judge. Prominent law professors started criticizing the court's unwillingness to verify the physical evidence in the case. Others questioned whether the judges could even be neutral because the victim was a judge. Civic groups like Good Judicial World and National Alliance for Judicial Reform started rallying in Kim's defense. They didn't all agree with what Kim Myeong-ho had done, but they agreed with why he did it. And they could see that this trial was stacked against him. His crossbow became a symbol for this movement. On October 15, 2007, the Seoul Eastern District Court sentenced Kim Myeong-ho to 4 years in prison for attempted murder, possession of illegal weapons, and violating the Firearms and Explosives Control Act. The court ruled the judiciary, as the last guardian of law, was the target of a serious premeditated act of violence. The possibility of future judicial harm must be prevented. Kim Myeong-ho was sent to Chuncheon prison and then Wonju prison to serve his full 4 years. He was released on January 24th, 2011. When he walked out of prison on January 24th, he had served every single day of his sentence, which, let me tell you, is very rare for people with perfect behavior like he did. After he was released, he was interviewed, and he said he didn't feel like he was the one who was punished. He said, "It wasn't him who lost in court. It was the judiciary. The real verdict had been delivered in the eyes of the people." The next year, in 2012, a film titled Burajin Hwasal was released to tell the story. Many people did not know the full extent of the story because many large news outlets in Korea are run by the government. This movie came out in theaters and told a fictionalized version of the story. But for the most part, it portrayed Kim Myeong-ho as an anti-hero against injustice. In just 8 days, the film passed the 1 million ticket mark, and the nation was angry once again. Not everyone could agree. Was he a criminal or a victim? Could he possibly be both? People went online to air their opinions, including judges who took to online forums defending the ruling. Other judges, like Judge Jung Young-jin of Suwon District Court, acknowledged that the judiciary is not perfect, and this was exposing problems within it. Kim Myeong-ho was not alone. University law professors, student associations, civic groups, they all began releasing their own statements. Some of them were condemning the court for failing to verify the blood, which was a crucial piece of evidence. I read through so many forum posts online, with hundreds more than I could even access, of people enraged at the system. I would not say that many people agreed with his actions, but there were so many people angry that the Korean criminal justice system thought that it was too powerful to be challenged. Reporters found the woman who threw that egg at the judge during the trial, and they interviewed her. She said, "When people like us protest, no one listens. But when a former professor speaks up, people finally pay attention." We're going to watch the film on Discord if you're listening to this episode as it comes out, but if you don't, then please go try and watch it on your own, because it's so monumental for this case. The film, Unbowed, became the new Silenced, which is another film that exposed horrific abuse in a school for deaf students. That film helped spark legal reform. But unfortunately, unlike Silenced, Unbowed did not result in legislative change. There have been no laws passed, no judges resigned, no revisiting the case. Kim Myeong-ho was never reinstated. But many surveys were conducted after the film's release that showed that the people's opinion of the criminal courts dropped noticeably. The message was clear: people couldn't trust the government. Professor Han Sang-hee, a legal scholar, said that if the arrow was the decisive evidence, and that evidence disappeared, then how can we say that justice was served? Kim Myeong-ho was outspoken following his release from prison. He launched a website called seokgung.org where he started posting court documents, transcripts, and scathing critiques of judges. He even wrote a book titled "What Are You, Judges?" full of accusations and profanity. In it, he called judges thugs in robes. He advocated for a system where the public could elect Supreme Court justices and prosecutors because he believed that they were just protecting their own and promoting their own. In the end, this case didn't just reveal the cracks in Korea's criminal justice system. It held a mirror up to all of their problems and made the judges look at them. The truth is, if you take away all the drama in this case, like the egg throwing, the shouting, whatnot, you're left with something even more unsettling. Because the basis of this case is that there was never a question of Kim Myeong-ho's guilt or innocence, but a question of the court's trust. The court was never determining whether or not he fired the arrow with the intent to murder Judge Park, or whether or not the arrow even pierced Judge Park's torso. They were determining whether or not they believed and trusted Judge Park, because disbelieving him would be turning against one of their own. I've never had to be a part of a trial, but for those who do, it shouldn't be a place where fairness is a privilege. Fairness should be expected. It should be standard. I want to leave you with some words that I read in the comment section of a review of the movie. Someone wrote, "When people feel the law is no longer theirs, they will resist, even if it means picking up a crossbow. and even if it means facing the law alone. Thank you for joining me on Korean True Crime. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it or leave a review. Check the description for a link to the Discord, Patreon, or to find new merch. Find my sources for free on Patreon. Thank you to my patrons for making this show possible. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.